How you doing of the Sacramento Beat? Thank you for joining, man.
Yeah, of course. Always good to see you, my man.
Well, I was gonna say, so Chris and I, just so everybody kind of gets in on the joke, Chris and I have this inside joke where I was creeping on his laptop when we were sitting in the media section and looked like Chris had up some type of garage band, something like that. And I asked you, Chris, are you making beats? So now I think the collab album is coming out pretty soon here. I think January 2025. We got to drop something.
Yeah, no, I think we should definitely should. I'll make some beats. I know you're great with verses and hooks. So yeah, we'll drop something hot for sure.
Well, I'll tell you this much. The Kings, they dropped a game last night, and it was a game that they could have had. Obviously, you're missing three of your most productive players. I've been asking the question throughout the show, Chris, and I'm curious your thoughts. What do we do with this loss? Do we just throw it away, or is there something to it when we're looking back at some of the bad losses of last season? I think everybody's trying to figure out what to do with this loss because you had opportunities. Keegan Murray, Kevin Huerter only combined for 16 points. It's not going to get it done, even with Keon balling out. Do we just throw the game away, or should it worry us a little bit?
I think there are elements of it to worry about. Like,
Mhm.
when your big addition is DeMar DeRozan, and I think when healthy, he's been an excellent addition for them. And when they've had him in the lineup, they've been, I think, a top 8 offense, despite sort of the clunky nature of his fit. I think it's been a really solid addition for them. But when he goes down and you lose Domantas Sabonis, also that creates a vacuum for production for guys like Keegan Murray and Kevin Herter. And Keegan in particular seems like, I don't know if he's pressing. I think it's fair to say his last few games haven't been particularly strong.
Mhm.
And while I'm not necessarily worried about the trajectory of Keegan Murray long term, this is somebody who you talk about potentially being, a $30 million a year player when he gets his
Right.
next contract. And when you're missing guys, he should be the type of player who can step in and give you 15, 20 points on top of the solid defense that he plays. So when he's turning the ball over, when he's not shooting it well, and when he seems out of sorts, and I know that the fouls were pretty ticky-tack for him last night, but when he is fouling out early, that's not what you're looking for a player when you talk about him in the sense of, is this a guy you're going to pay 30, $40 million a year going forward beyond the season? Is this a guy that you're holding on to instead of trading for Lauri Markkanen, right? Like,
Yeah.
it was a sticking point with the Jazz trade that they wanted Keegan Murray, and this was reported, I think, by Anthony Slater, the Athletic. And the Kings did not put Murray in that trade. Your expectations for him based on the potential contract and those trade talks are pretty
Right.
high.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit worrisome for me, but it's not the end of the world. It's November. You're banged up. You're missing 3 of your top 5 scorers, right? So it's understandable from that standpoint, but in terms of the production that you need from Keegan Murray and Kevin Herter, I think that's a little bit worrisome going forward.
Talking to Chris Biderman of the Sacramento Bee. Let's stick with Keegan Murray here, Chris, because his dad, Kenyon Murray, has been on social media talking about he needs to go in the post more and go back to what he was doing at Iowa. I'm drafting an email to him right now, trying to get him on the show as well. I've been seeing two sides of this. One side is every time Mike Brown is asked about Keegan Murray, he says, we're asking him to do a lot. So there's that side of it. We're seeing, or I'm seeing from some callers, some texters, just fans in general, you're asking him to rebound and defend and shoot. How is that too much for, like you said, a guy who you're willing to hold on, or is a sticking point for Lauri Markkanen? So where do you fall on that scale? Do you think they're asking them to do too much, or should he be able to do what they're asking him to do? Because in my opinion, I'm thinking, well, this is year 2 now of we're asking Keegan to do a lot and he can't shoot. So maybe stop doing that. That's how much longer are you going to wait to see if he can put it all together?
Yeah, I think it speaks to potentially some depth issues with the roster. Obviously,
Yes.
particularly when you're missing some guys. But if you don't have other guys who can defend an opponent's top perimeter player, and Keon Ellis obviously can, but Keon Ellis is a smaller guard, or at least a smaller shooting guard. When Keegan Murray is generally tasked with the toughest perimeter assignment every night, that says you don't really have any better options. And I'm not saying Keegan Murray is better or Keegan Murray is bad at that. I'm saying that, if he's your top option, then maybe you are going to lose some of the shooting. Maybe you are going to lose some of the offensive production. Whereas if you had a little bit more depth, or you had somebody else who you could bring off the bench who could handle that defensive assignment, maybe you do get more production from Keegan Murray elsewhere. And the Kings don't really have that. We've seen the last couple nights, it's been, Mason Jones off the bench. Colby Jones got a little bit more run last night. They just don't have a ton of wing depth. And obviously you're missing DeMar DeRozan and Malik Monk. I understand that, but you don't really have anybody to play the bigger perimeter players defensively aside from Keegan. And, Trey Lyles isn't necessarily that guy. So while I think given the shape of the roster, you have to ask that of Keegan, it might be a little unfair to ask that of him on a night in and night out basis while also expecting him to shoot 40% from three and score 20 points a night. He might just not necessarily be that guy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just might go to show that you need a little bit more depth if he's going to be a primary offensive player.
Talking to Chris Biderman, Sacramento Bee. Chris, let's switch over now to the Niners. Chris, are they done? Are they cooked? The Niners?
I don't think they're cooked. You were definitely on red alert. But you have 40% of the season left, right? Yeah. You have 7 games, and I understand that it hasn't looked great. And you have 2 of your tougher games on the schedule. Probably next week against Buffalo, coming off their bye week, is going to be the toughest game they have on their schedule. But there's 40% of the season to be played, and this is a team with a lot of experience that's generally played a lot of really good football in November and December. That being said, there are some very alarming things happening, I think, particularly on the offensive side. The Niners, according to NFL Next Gen stats, their pass catchers are worse in the league at getting separation. And when you look at what Kyle Shanahan has prioritized in drafting and adding pass catchers through free agency, it's the ability to separate, right? And when you lose Brandon Ayuk for the season and you don't have Ricky Pearsall for most of the year until the last 3 games, those are your best separators typically. And, you haven't had the separation that you would like to get. And the Niners are also 30th out of 32 teams in YAC, yards after the catch. And if you've watched this team the last few years, you could always bank on their guys being able to separate and guys being able to get yards after the catch. And they're not doing that. And despite all that, the Niners are still 5th in EPA per pass play, which I think speaks to how well Brock Purdy's been playing despite the circumstances. And obviously Brock Purdy missed that throw on the last drive. They had the 2nd down and 11 that might have sealed the game, or at least gave him a much better chance at winning it there. But I just think, the offensive line hasn't been playing particularly well. Jake Brendel is not having a great year. Colton McKivitz isn't having a great year. Without George Kittle, the Niners really struggle to run the ball as consistently as they do with him. So I think it's not one thing. I think you can look to a bunch of different things pointing to why the offense isn't nearly as good. On top of the fact, the special teams has been one of the worst in the league. So you're not winning on the margins there. And defensively, the defense has been hovering around the top 10 throughout the season, but they haven't made that clutch play. They haven't gotten that clutch sack, that clutch turnover late in games. And obviously allowing, teams to score late in the last 2 minutes of games, particularly the 3 division losses that they have, super problematic. So you can look at all 3 phases and find fault with all 3 phases to why this is a 5-5 team instead of a team that, probably should be 7-3 if they just stop shooting themselves in the foot as often as they have.
Well, that speaks to where I want to go with this next question. Chris Biderman here, Sacramento Bee. What to do with Kyle Shanahan? Because there are people out there saying, hey, fire Kyle Shanahan. I am not one of those people, Chris. I think it's ridiculous to fire him, but I do think that losing this game and the game that they've lost this season makes it no longer ridiculous if somebody wants to talk about it. So I think that it's ridiculous to do it, but I'm not laughing somebody out the room if they want to sit there and say, go get Ben Johnson, whoever it is. So as far as Kyle Shanahan is concerned, what do you think Kyle Shanahan is struggling with, and how does he need to evolve? And do you think this thing could get dicey if they miss the playoffs. Maybe not a firing, but hey, your seat's a little bit warm, and we really need to see what you do next season.
Yeah, so I think I always say, like, when people talk about firing a head coach, I say, all right, who are you going to bring in who's going to be better?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you can always point to the hot offensive coordinator candidate. You can point to Ben Johnson and say, hypothetically, maybe he's an upgrade over Kyle Shanahan. We've never seen Ben Johnson be a head coach, right?
No.
So we don't know. That's a hypothetical scenario. So to say that he would come in and the 49ers would win the Super Bowl in their first year, I think is kind of wishful thinking, or at least highly unlikely, right? So Kyle Shanahan, I think, is probably a top 5 coach in the league, but at the same time is not having a great year. And I think he's not having a great year in large part because of, I think schematically there are some interesting things happening. I think 49ers relying a lot less on play action, and they're using a lot more of the traditional passing game, kind of going away from their strengths, right? We talk about Kyle Shanahan's offensive strengths. It's outside zone, play action, getting guys open in the middle of the field. This year, it's a lot of shotgun, 5-step drops, long developing plays. And it just hasn't been as effective and as efficient. And you're putting a whole lot more on Brock Purdy's plate and making his job a lot more difficult than it was last year. So I think there are certainly valid criticisms for Kyle Shanahan, but I would say if you're firing him, you're probably firing a top 5 coach in the league. And it's going to be, I would say, virtually impossible to hire a top 5 coach in the league unless you really think, the only name that would make sense for me is like Bill Belichick. And even at this point in his career, I'm not positive that Bill Belichick is a better coach than Kyle Shanahan. So I'm not saying Kyle Shanahan is flawless, and I'm not saying Kyle Shanahan has had a great season. I just think you're going to be really hard pressed to find an upgrade if you were to make a move. And there's a lot of parity in the NFL, and the 49ers are a handful of plays away from, like I said, being 7-3 instead of 5-2. And we're not really talking about the sky falling as much as we are now. Now, if Kyle Shanahan fails to make the playoffs in 2 consecutive years, then I think after next year, after 2025, we can have a legitimate conversation about it. But the fact that the 49ers have had long playoff runs in as many years as they have under Kyle Shanahan, I think it would be kind of short-sighted to want to fire him after one lackluster season.
Yeah, Andy Reid, normally the comparison when it comes to Kyle Shanahan has gone to more Super Bowls than Andy Reid went to when Andy Reid was with the Eagles, and he's just had deeper playoff runs than what Andy Reid had. I think when Andy Reid got laid off from the Eagles, I don't know if he was considered top 5, definitely a top coach, but I don't think where Kyle Shanahan is right now. So I like to use that comparison, and it's close, but I still think Kyle Shanahan has a longer leash based on what he's done these last couple seasons.
Didn't Andy Reid coach, was it 20 years he coached in the NFL as a head coach before winning a Super Bowl?
Yeah. And he needed Patrick Mahomes to do it.
Right. So I think, I fully understand why 49ers fans have this Super Bowl or bust mentality given the history of the organization. Mm-hmm. But I think when it comes to what's realistic in this modern NFL with salary cap restraints, with all the parity in the league, I think it's I don't think you want to be firing a pretty good or a really good head coach just after one bad season when there's so much history of having good seasons.
Nope, but you got to be better. Chris Biderman, you're always good, so we never have to worry about you being better. Thanks so much for joining us, Sacramento Bee. Go check out all of Chris's work. Chris, all right, the mixtape drops soon. Styles and Beads, how about that? That's dropping January 2025.
I'll see you in the studio.
There you go. Thank you, Chris Biderman. Enjoy the rest of your week. We will talk to you soon. On the other side, it's time to bring back the old pocket watching. How are teams doing in the NBA, and how can the Kings make sure that they stay close in the race? Allen Stiles, Sactown Sports.
On the move, got